Hello, friends, and welcome to Impact Everywhere, the podcast that looks for people having a positive impact in unexpected places. Today, our guest is Branden Harvey, and this episode is the most positive episode we've ever had for the simple reason that Branden is the founder of Good, which is a newspaper, a newsletter, a podcast, and so much more. Branden and I first met, I think, 3 or 4 years ago at an event called Adobe Max, and I had my electric skateboard. We met up at a bar, and I gave him a ride, and just established a really cool connection. And I've been watching from the sidelines as he took what was just a really quirky Kickstarter idea and built it into an entire media company. When I met Branden, he was the most popular Snapchat photographer. He had millions of followers. He was traveling the world. He was spreading stories of happiness and joy, but he wanted to do a little bit more. And that little bit more started off with a physical newspaper. So basically, in an era where digital is king and newspapers left and right were going bankrupt and out of business, Branden thought it would be great to start a physical newspaper, but focusing on the good news happening around the world. In the last few years, he's learned a lot about how positivity spreads, where to find it, and most importantly, how to feel empowered as you look to this dark and divided world. And that's why I knew I had to have him on this podcast. So without further ado, this is Branden Harvey, and here he is explaining how he finds good news to share with the world. I hope you enjoy.
The great thing is, it's not like we are trying to be a completely alternative journalistic platform. Like, we love journalists, we love other news outlets, and we don't think anybody should unsubscribe from the New York Times or stop listening to NPR and just listen to us. We think people should be paying attention to the news broadly. And so because of that, we are super happy to source from vetted, trusted sources who are doing original reporting when other people beat us to stories. And I think both those examples you just listed are stories from other folks. We do our research to make sure it's not absolute fakeness. But the great thing is, the problem isn't that there's a lack of good news. It's that people haven't been designing ways for that good news to actually absorb on a deeper level. And so that's our specialty.
Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think people haven't taken the time to design good news in a way for it to be sticky, the same way that, say, outrageous news happens to be?
It's because bad news just sticks easier. It's not that bad news is working harder. It's that our brains actually have an internal negativity bias. Bad news sticks to our brains like Velcro, and good news slides right off our brains like Teflon. We first learned about this back in like 2014 or something from Dr. Rick Hansen. And he popularized this idea or brought it to light. And this internal negativity bias is what plagues us with so many levels of our lives. It's the reason why we'll all have a million positive things that happen to us today. And then when we go to bed, the thing that we probably are going to think about is the one negative thing, or we're going to get a bunch of positive comments on our next Instagram post. But really, the thing that we're going to harp on after 24 hours is going to be the one negative or the one cynical comment that somebody left. And that's why traditional journalism has that idea that if it bleeds, it leads. It's not because journalists are just trying to, it's ultimately that they're creating things based off of what people want. And the unfortunate thing is, it's not what we want at our core, in our hearts. It's not like we want more bad news. It's just that's what our brains respond to. Therefore, we click on it more, we read it more. And so with good news, you really have to work double time, maybe 10 times as hard to really absorb that good news on the same level as bad news.
It's so interesting hearing you break it down, because it makes sense. It's the entire principle upon which gratitude exercises are supposed to be built on, right? Because
Exactly.
we forget all the good, we take it for granted, it just slides off like you just described so beautifully. But then when you package this into a business model, everything follows the path of least resistance. And so
Yes.
if it's easier to talk about bad stuff and it generates more clicks and it gets people coming back, and it then builds this negative cycle, then that's where sort of things end up flowing, unfortunately.
That's 100%. So what we're trying to do is, we're not just trying to find It's not that our only quote unquote enemy is bad news, because at good, we see the other side of the coin sometimes ends up being that with other platforms is people just completely remove themselves from the news. They say, oh, the news is so bad, I'm going to pay attention to cute puppy videos. I'm going to pay attention to like amazing like celebrity videos, like all these things that we love. But I would argue that's not what's going to make you feel more hopeful. And the science would back this up. All of that is the absence of bad news. And at Good, we try to find this balance between the overwhelming heartbreak of the injustices in the world and wanting to maintain your sanity. And so what we do is we find the hope within the heartbreak. We look for the people creating solutions to problems. And we share reminders on how we can all get involved in making a difference when it comes to the solutions that overwhelm us. And that is actually where true hopefulness comes from. There's this difference between hopefulness and optimism. There's this quote from somebody I deeply admire. His name is Eric Liu. And he said, to be optimistic is to assume that things will work out. To be hopeful is to realize things can work out if you work at them. Hope requires responsibility and agency. Optimism relieves us of both. In rooting for your favorite sports team, choose optimism. In rooting for democracy, choose hope. And so what we try to do is we really do try to lean into that sense of hope that's always rooted in action. It's rooted in the things that we all do to move the world forward. And so that breaks down with cute videos. It also breaks down with just standing on the sidelines, watching people do good. It really is about that action, ultimately.
Yeah. Before nailing in on the action part, I want to talk about your marketing part, because what you were describing a little bit earlier was the challenges that it takes to actually make good news stick. And what I heard was that you don't ignore the bad news. You simply blend the blood and the medic at the same time. Like you're like putting both in the equation. So you're not really losing out on one or the other.
Yep.
What does that make the process significantly harder? Does it make it easier? Does it really work? Like, what are the repercussions of this new formula that you're experimenting with?
I will say it's terrible marketing. Like what I'm telling you right now will only interest the amazing geeks who care about impact who are listening. And for the rest of the world, they hear homework. They hear that this isn't going to be fun and easy. And I didn't actually even think about it till after we started doing it. But the marketing is everything else that we do. So like one thing is we pride ourselves in having beautiful design. And I can't take an ounce of credit for that because I don't design anything we do. We have amazing designers and artists on our team, and they make the things that we create beautiful. They make our Instagram posts like gorgeous, and not just gorgeous, but designed to look really good when you repost them to your story. Designed to make you want to keep on swiping and scrolling through them so you actually engage with all the content. We make our print publication a newspaper so it feels novel. And we make the cover something gorgeous enough that you leave it out on your coffee table so that you keep on picking it up day after day and you want to pass along to friends. And we fill the inside with art that you want to cut out or hang on your wall, or grab the poster from the center and put on your wall as daily reminders of the good in the world. And so all of those things combined are ultimately the marketing that probably hook most people in. And again, we're completely transparent about it. We're trying to trick everybody, myself included, into absorbing more good news because our brains just don't absorb good news. But we want good news. Like we're not tricking people into doing something that's ultimately bad for them. We're just tricking people into doing something that our brains for some reason decided not to love. And the first thing is definitely the design. The second thing is everybody on paper wants good news. If I tell you, hey, do you want me to send you one email a week where we tell you all the good that's happening? Like you'll say yes. Like nobody's, oh, that's not for me. So we do have that side of things. The question is, how do we make sure that people keep on reading it when the bad emails in their inbox are going to pull them a little bit further? How do we make sure that you don't just skim the headlines, but you maybe go deep on one or two to refill that little hope tank in your chest every time you get the email. So there's all these next levels that some of them work for us, some of them work against us. And we're just trying to, think through all of them.
I'm subscribed to your newsletter. And so I totally resonate with that because I'm now comparing, let's say, a Bored Panda newsletter email that comes in versus a good newsletter that comes in. The Bored Panda one is zero effort. I know that I can open it, I can click through it, whatever. I'll like giggle and then like.
And it's a delightful email, but it's a distraction.
Exactly. It's more distraction but not actually change. So I think it's so interesting that you're taking the harder route to do things because it's actually the difference between junk food and nutritious food. And I actually think that's the distinction between entertainment and art. It's something that I've been trying to give a lot of thought to because entertainment and art often get lumped into the same category. But there's the core difference between the two of them, I believe, is that entertainment, you can just eat it all day long, like junk food, but it doesn't actually nourish your body. Art, on the other hand, is supposed to challenge you to think differently, to shift your perspectives. It can still be it can be a good meal. It can taste good, but it just still requires that little bit more work to get into. And so what you're talking about using all this design to overcome friction is really interesting. In the journey that you've been on, your goal isn't just to get people to read something and get on with their day. You want them to actually move to action. Can you walk me through how you design that into your stories and your product?
Yes. For one thing, at the beginning of every print issue, we say, we hope that this issue leaves you more hopeful, but ultimately we hope it doesn't stop there. Everything is always about that next action step, no matter what we do. And the big way that we do this is, I guess, a few things. So when it comes to print, we've got this thing that we created called the Good Bar, where at the bottom of every page, we say, here's how you can get involved in the story you just read. And we have it in a good, better, best format. Because let's say that we want to talk about sustainability. We just had a story about sustainability. We say, here's how to make a difference for sustainability. Super broad. I know that step 3 is to create this incredible, elaborate photo experience where you take apart computers and you photograph them underwater with mermaids. I don't know who would ever do something like that, but that's step 3, obviously. But the problem is nobody in the world, only one person in the world will jump straight to step 3. Everybody else needs an on-ramp. And so step 1 might be, hey, why don't you take part in plastic-free July? Or why don't you switch to tree-free toilet paper? Like, it's one small thing that you can do. And then the goal is that small step would give you the dopamine hit, the energy to go, oh my gosh, I did that. And it made a difference. Here's the tangible difference it made. What's the next step? The next step is donate to this organization. Volunteer to do trash pickup in your neighborhood. Whatever it is, it's that next step. And then from there, you're like, okay, cool. What's next? But we never expect people to go from 0 to 100. The other thing that we do is within each of those things, and we do this on Instagram too, there will be a tragedy that happens. I think about the heartbreaking explosion that happened in Beirut. And I saw this Twitter thread, like within hours of the explosion, from this wonderful Lebanese influencer who wanted to make a difference. And here are 100 ways you can make a difference for Lebanon right now. And she had this thread of, 50 tweets where she listed every organization on the ground. I don't know how many people actually made a single donation or took a single piece of action from that because the amount of options was so overwhelming. And so when Good shared a piece of content, we said, here's the one organization to donate to if you want to provide food. Here's the one organization you donate to if you want to support search and rescue operations. And here's one organization to donate to support long-term infrastructure rebuilding. Pick your lane, pick one organization and support that. And if you can't do that, share this post so that others recognize what happened in this part of the country that people don't often pay attention to. We made it super clear so that we can get rid of that decision fatigue. And that goes into this idea of helping people be better equipped to make a difference in the world, because we should be the ones doing the hard work to let people know how to make a difference. And then all they have to do is apply a few dollars or a few minutes towards that thing. And they can graduate up to things that are next level, but for the vast majority of people, you just need that first step to get you over that hump.
And in many ways, it's also more effective, right? Because you can do it once, and now thousands and thousands of people don't need to do all that thinking over and over again. So
exactly.
From the economies of scale, it's perfect. If only everyone thought about it this way from a news distribution perspective. So I really love that. To take this on a completely human level and to maybe bring it super personal, how have you changed as a result of being inundated with all this good? What has changed in your life?
So I will say the first thing that we started before the newspaper was the podcast, which you were a guest on, and everybody loved your episodes so much. But early on in that podcast, I thought that the show was going to be conversations with happy, positive, optimistic people. And it was me just trying to say, what is going on with these people? And I really didn't have a clue about this idea that I was talking about before, this difference between hopefulness and optimism. I didn't have a clue between like genuine, real good news and quote unquote feel good news. And over the course of probably the first 50 episodes, you can listen and hear me ask a bunch of questions where I'm like, wait, you're working every day with refugees in heartbreaking situations. Why are you happy? Like, why do you not look like you're totally in despair all the time? And it was genuine like confusion. And I did not know what was going on. Over the course of, a year, I really did start to figure out like, oh, the most hopeful people are the people who are willing to look at the heartbreak, the pain, the injustice, to stare at it in the face, to get close to it, and to take action anyway. They don't let it overwhelm them. And the reason why they don't let it overwhelm them is because they actively they are actively choosing to be a part of the solution. And when you're actively a part of the solution, you cannot feel hopeless because you know that you have power. And even people who are up against huge obstacles, I think about Scott Harrison of Charity Water, for example. The global water crisis is huge, and Charity Water has just made a 2% dent in it over the last 10 years or something like that. But the reality is, because they made that 2% dent, they go, oh my gosh, we just need billions more dollars and we can solve this thing. Billions more dollars in 10 more years and we can make this happen. Like they figured out the formula, which is we do something and we can change this end result. And so for me, that has been totally transformative for me, where I went from genuinely avoiding bad news because I thought bad news was bad. I thought that it was getting in the way of positivity and happiness and hopefulness. And now I look at bad news straight in the face. And I just do what Mr. Rogers says to do. He says, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And literally, no matter what heartbreaking situation, big or small, natural disaster, man-made disaster, political disaster, we have always found people who are on the front lines working to create solutions, sometimes publicly and sometimes privately behind the scenes. And there have been ways to support them and to get involved and become a part of what they're doing. And that's what makes me feel hopeful. And so, to be honest, I've been just totally transformed as a person from feeling like I had to be Mr. Positive the whole time to being like, oh, I can really absorb a lot of this heartbreak and pain and injustice. Like I can look it in the face. And as long as I stay motivated and focused on solutions, I will remain hopeful. That's the big thing for me is I think I went from this totally fake positivity to something that genuinely feels like it's part of my core. And I'm sure I've got a million more miles of work to do, but like it's night and day. And I wish the same for everybody in our community who is joining us in this work.
Interesting. So these days you're a lot more hopeful. Do you ever lose hope? I guess I'm just trying to figure out like this balance, right? Because on one hand, I'm going to assume that you feel so inspired by all these amazing stories. On the other hand, it can have a blowback effect where you're like, man, there are all these amazing people on the front lines doing all this stuff. And here I am just doing X, like the kind of internal narrative critic. And so has it only been a positive? Has there been also negative? How is that balancing out? If we like go one step deeper.
Yeah, I would say my life was so much easier when I wasn't paying attention to the bad. Yeah, it was definitely easier. Now, every day, I'm looking at more bad news stories than the average news consumer. And to be honest, it's exhausting. It's really hard. And I think it's Brene Brown, but it might be Glennon Melton, talks about this idea that you can't selectively numb emotions. And so if you are just numbing pain, and a lot of people do this with addiction of all kinds, but if you're selectively numbing pain, you're also selectively numbing joy. And so I do feel like my highs are high, my lows are low. And so we've seen so many bad political stories over the last month, and they hit me hard. Like I mourn them, and they're devastating. But I feel like they're never completely debilitating, because I do genuinely believe that we can actively be a part of the solution to those problems. And so, and that's the other thing that absolutely sucks. Oh my gosh. When something bad happens, I can't assume that somebody else is going to be the good. I have to do it. So when I see something bad happening in politics, it's my job to start making phone calls to my representatives. It's my job to start making phone calls to voters. When I see something bad that happens on the other side of the world, I can't just assume that somebody's going to show up and donate money to the organizations there. I have to put my money where my mouth is myself. And so I set aside a budget. I set aside time. I set aside emotional energy to do these things. When I look back over the last several years of doing this, so many of these stories have seen progress. And for that, I feel hopeful. So yeah, there's a million terrible things about this, but I do feel like it's better in the end.
I love the answer. It sparked like a whole new thought that I've never had before. Part of me was really hoping that you would say, oh, as a result of doing all this good news, life is beautiful. Like I was hoping for this blanket answer, because
that's true. If I was to shorten what I just said, I think that's the shortened version. But
but it's perfect, because you go one step deeper. And when you go one step deeper, one, it sounded initially exhausting. And it is, because to make a difference and to not take your privilege for granted, it requires work. That is, I think, something that we forget about. We forget that our privilege comes with some form of responsibilities attached to it. But then as you were speaking, I was like, maybe the solution is to set aside this quota, like emotional quota and financial quota aside, or a number of hours in your week to take action. And then you can actually like budget for it. Yes. You can say, this is what I'm going to do. And I've never thought about change in that way, but it helps everyone set expectations, right? I don't know about you, but generally I feel most disappointed in myself when my expectations are one place and my actual ability to execute on them is somewhere else. And there seems to be some kind of calibration opportunity there based on what I just heard you, like the reactions and the systems you've built around yourself to be empowered to do something.
Well, that's what self-care truly is. A lot of people think about self-care as bubble baths and face masks, which I'm in favor of, but that's reactionary self-care. And proactive self-care is saying, what are the things that I can do to set myself up for success so that I already am taken care of before the low moment hits? And so I've got this monthly budget set aside for donations. I use like essentially the envelope system. So I put the money in there every time that I pay myself. And my rule is I have to spend it before the end of the month. Because there was a time where I would be like, oh, there's going to be a bigger problem that comes along, so I'll save it for that. And at one point, I had hundreds of dollars saved up in this section of my app. And it wasn't going anywhere because I felt like I had to hold on to it and save it up. And so when I made the rule, oh my gosh, I have to spend this every month, it just allowed me to just use it more freely, to be like, oh, $10 for this, $50 for this. It's so much better. And I think the same is good with our time. What if we just put it in our calendar to say, during this time, I'm going to do good. And maybe I'll set myself up with a few ways that I can help anytime I want to. Maybe you sign up to become a counselor for Crisis Text Line or the Trevor Project hotline, become an online volunteer there, find some ways that you can volunteer with an organization digitally. That way, when you've got some free time, you can just do it. As a part of a series for Good to Good, we've been interviewing volunteers. And I keep on asking them, I'm like, why are you doing this? How are you doing this? Because I am not actively a volunteer for any organization. And I'm really inspired by the people who are. And they say they just found an organization. It's not one that they loved. It's not one they were like crazy passionate about, but they saw an opportunity to do good. And they just set aside time on their calendar and they did it. And the more that they did it, the more that they liked it. And sometimes it sucked at the beginning, but they liked it a year in. And I'm like, oh, that's just so practical. Like they chose to do this. They sacrificed to do this. And that's what love is, sacrifice. And so how can you proactively set yourself up to sacrifice? And I've got a lot of growing to do there, but I think that actually just makes it so much more palatable and less overwhelming to just have a plan.
Definitely. Another follow-up question on that, and maybe this is too much since you're still working on it, but how would you know when you're doing enough? How do you know when you're doing enough good to compensate for all the bad? And the reason I ask the question is because I don't actually know if the world is worse off today than it was 10 years ago, but I feel like the world is way worse off than it is than 10 years ago. And so with that, comes the mounting guilt. Like, I need to do more. There's not enough time. There needs to be more action that comes in. And so there's this true sense of nothing I do is ever going to be enough. So do you play with that at all? Do you just ignore it? What words of wisdom do you have there?
Good question. And I want to preempt it by responding to two things you mentioned earlier briefly that I think were so spot on. The first is that if you look at the arc of history, the world continues to get better and better every year by almost every mark. If you could choose to be born at any time in history without knowing where you would be born, the religion that your family holds, what color your skin would be, how much money your family would have when you're born, you would absolutely choose this very day in 2020 because on every count, your life would be more likely to be better. With that said, the one blip on the radar is 2020. So if you feel like this year is terrible, statistically, there are a lot of bad things that happen. The progress against violence that we've made over the last 20 years, this year we've seen an increase in violence. Of course, this pandemic has been a huge increase of things. The white supremacy we're seeing was rolling back decades of progress we've made against bigotry and the violence related to it. So if you feel like this year is a terrible year, you're not wrong, but it is a blip on the radar and we can course correct and the world will go back to that moment of progress. The other thing that I wanted to respond to is you mentioned privilege. And I should say that I am speaking as a straight white dude living in a cush city in the United States of America. I have about as much privilege as somebody can have. I guess I could have a few $1 million. That would make me a little bit more privileged. But besides the fact that I do not have a lot of money, I carry a lot of privilege. And that's why I feel so strongly that it is my responsibility to be actively involved and engaged because I have the choice not to be. I consume bad news on television, on the internet, and on podcasts. Some people consume bad news because they heard about it happening to their brother, to their husband. I think about Black women in America and how they have never had a choice but to fight for the causes that affect them because they have been so affected by so many things, whether it's police violence and the impact on them and their families, whether it's the ability to vote, whether it's so many things, they didn't have a choice but to choose to fight for these things. And so the fact that I have a choice and I'm also emotionally not burdened by the weight of the threats against me and people who look like me, like I have to use that privilege. And so if you're listening to this and you're somebody who carries less privilege than me, you should show yourself more grace than me. You should feel okay with bubble baths and face masks because you need the opportunity to rest and to recuperate. And I hope that more people who share my privilege will step up and be the ones to help give you a breather so that you don't have to fight every day. Hopefully I can be the one fighting. And I know that with that comes the fact that I have a lot of learning to do. A lot of mistakes will be made because I'm not facing these problems. But that's what I'm trying to do with Good too, is say, how do we show up and bring these resources to people so that they're equipped to do good in a way that is helpful and not harmful, in a way that is actionable and doable. And so to circle all the way back around, Ben, to your question of how much is enough, it may never be enough, but I don't think that needs to overwhelm us. Like, if I work hard every day to make a difference in the world, there will still be more problems to solve. And so at one point, I do have to break. I have to rest. I have to enjoy the company of the people that I'm with. I think about a few years ago when I had the beautiful opportunity to see the Congressman John Lewis speak in Nashville, Tennessee. And Nashville was where he did a lot of his activism. And he was arrested a lot in Nashville, and he was bloodied in Nashville. But what he spoke to that day that I saw him speak was the celebrations that they would hold after a protest or a march or an action, the dancing and the singing and the drinking that would take place. And there was obviously still so much work to be done. But John Lewis and Martin Luther King and all of the icons who we know from the civil rights movement still took the time to enjoy themselves during that time. And I thought that was just so beautiful and special that he shared that, and that was actually the motivation to continue going. And so I hope that I can continue to find that balance, and I will never have the answer on, am I doing enough? And I don't presume that I'm doing anywhere close to enough, or that I fully am deserving of celebration in the same way that John Lewis was. But I think it's a good question to ask yourself. And here's the other thing, just like with our good, better, best, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. I just think about around my home, there's so many products that I have that are plastic or toxic. And my wife, a few years back, when we decided that we wanted to start being more sustainable, we wanted to use less chemicals in our lives, we didn't just throw out everything in our house that was bad. It's just that one by one, when we saw an opportunity, when we would run out of a certain cleaning supply, we would run out of a certain dish soap, whatever it is, then we would just replace it with something good. And so I think that's the thing that I would ultimately encourage people to do is when you see an opportunity to shift your life 1%, to do a little bit more good, do that thing. So it doesn't mean you have to be volunteering every day. What does it look like to just do an extra thing here or there? What does it look like to just donate to one organization a month where you have the funds? And then when you find out, oh, you've got a little bit more money, add in a second one. What does it look like to focus on sustainability this year? And then next year, you can focus on something else. I think there's a million ways to make a difference. And I don't think anybody should judge somebody else for what they're choosing to prioritize first right here, right now. But I think what matters is that when you see an opportunity, you just take that opportunity. And when you see another opportunity, that's probably a sign that you're ready to take that next opportunity.
It's a beautiful way to think about it. I really like it. There's a book by James Clear called Atomic Habits, where he talks about the importance of celebrating the process and working on these small daily habits that you work on. And he's this one quote, which is that if you get better by 1% every day for an entire year, you end up 37 times better than you were.
That's
because
incredible.
of like compound change. Yeah. And so it's about just finding those things and not going backwards. Because if you skip a day, that compound progress that you've made is also compound reversal. Right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
If you get 1% worse every day, you end up at 0. So I really like the way you thought about it. And if you're only doing one small thing, one little change that you stick to, and if you can do that every time that opportunity comes knocking, and for whatever reason, if the opportunity that comes knocking, you're not ready for it yet, that's fine. It'll come back. There'll be more of them. So
totally.
I like that way of looking at it. I think that's really beautiful. Back to your personal life, if we like rewind back till I think you were 16 when you first picked up a camera, because you actually have a background as an artist.
Yes.
And you started off as a photographer. You floated through humanitarian work, ended up becoming an influencer, and now somehow you are running this amazing newspaper on good news. So could you explain to me how the different inflection points in your life have guided you to where you are today?
Yeah, I think I can look back and see a pretty clear path on how I moved through the world and how I ended up where I am. And it could look like, oh, I plotted this whole thing out. But the reality was I had no idea what I was doing the whole time. I felt overwhelmed by my identity. Who am I? What do I call myself? What do I put on my LinkedIn profile? What do I put on my Instagram bio? How do I introduce myself at parties? And only now do I feel mildly comfortable with what I'm doing. And even then, I don't expect that I'll stay this comfortable for a while.
It's because you're old or getting older.
Honestly, yes, it's very scary. I'm like, oh, should I be moisturizing my face now?
By the way, for the listeners, Brandon's how old are you?
I think I'm 27. Yep. Yeah. So like you said, I started off shooting photos when I was 16, and I usually gloss over this part, but I started off as a wedding photographer and shooting senior photos. It was just what was available in my town at the time. That's the opportunity that I had and the connections that I had. I was in a college town, so I knew people getting married. I was a high schooler, so I knew people graduating. And I had a mentor who brought me through the photography world. Her name is Karen, and she was the one who taught me that no matter what skill set you have, because you have the privilege of having that skill set, it's important that you use it for good. And she was the first person who taught me that. And so I always just held on to that. She brought me on a few shoots where we did a help portrait shoot. If you're a fan of Jeremy Cowart, he started this organization, Help Portrait, where photographers every year on December 1st use their photography for good, oftentimes volunteering with makeup artists to shoot beautiful portraits of people experiencing homelessness or housing instability. And so Karen brought me along in a few shoots like that. And it was really game changing for me, but I didn't think that much of it. I was just like, oh yeah, I should just do this thing because I have the opportunity. When I go off to college, I moved to Portland, Oregon, which from my perspective, moving from a small little town, it felt like nonprofit central. Everywhere I went was a sign for not a business, it was for a nonprofit. And I even had a mentor at the time who basically had this joke. He's like, when I was a kid, all my friends and I would start bands. Now, if you're a kid, you start a nonprofit. And the sentiment felt very true. That just everybody had a nonprofit and they were all around. And maybe it was just that like my hometown, it felt like we had two nonprofits and one of them was Goodwill. And just being all around though, I was like, oh, this is so inspiring. I should volunteer with these nonprofits. And that's what first got me involved in the world of solutions and documenting people who were creating solutions to projects or to problems. And so as I started to develop more relationships with nonprofits, they started saying, hey, we actually have another branch over in North Carolina. Can you fly out there, shoot some photos there? Help us tell this story of the impact we're making there. Oh, we've got a thing in Philadelphia. Can you go out to Philadelphia? And then eventually they're saying, hey, can you go to Rwanda and document the work that we're doing there? And I started traveling to all kinds of different pockets around the world. And it wasn't that I was photographing the nonprofits. It's that I was photographing people on the ground who had devoted their lives to creating solutions, often at personal sacrifice. I think about this man in the Philippines who, I think he was a pastor, and he just saw, oh, people have this need and this need, but we are a very poor church. We don't have the financial resources to pay for those things. So I'm also going to become an entrepreneur, and I'm going to figure out how to start this company that helps solve these problems by providing people with work, by providing people with resources, and then using the money that we make to solve these other problems. And he's just this Filipino man who chose to make a difference in this way. And I think about Rwanda, and I think about the amazing people who devoted their lives to learning about nursing so that they could help fight the AIDS epidemic in their country. And they were successful over the course of decades in fighting back against this disease that we, have solutions for. We just need to implement. And getting to document all these stories was just so inspiring to me. And so I was like, oh, they'll be inspiring to other people too. And that began the process of figuring out, how do I tell these stories, not just to the donors, which was really my job, but also like, how do I reach other people just so they feel hopeful? And that's where my own personal Instagram audience and my Snapchat audience came into play, where I was, instead of just sharing mountains and waterfalls, let me share some of these stories with long form captions or a long explanation. And people started to surprisingly be open to that on a platform that was mostly for the joke really was like, nobody wants to see your breakfast. That's what Instagram was at this time. And all of a sudden here I am talking about like HIV and AIDS in Rwanda. And, you're scrolling through and it's like Cinnamon Toast Crunch, waffles, HIV and AIDS in Rwanda, melon medley. And so surprisingly, we were able to cut through the noise probably because it was so different. And my question over time just became like, what are the other ways to cut through the noise? What are the other ways to surprise people with this good news? And one thing that I definitely realized early on was, I don't have to be a part of this. It doesn't have to be about me. It doesn't have to live on a platform that says Branden Harvey. I think it can be bigger than me. And I certainly shouldn't be the only filter that these stories go through. And so that's when good really started, when I realized this should be something that more people can be a part of and can reach more people beyond the people who follow my antics on social media. And so for all during that process, I really thought, I am a photographer. I am a photographer. And there was a point where I realized, I'm not just a photographer. I just use photography to tell stories, and specifically to tell stories of the good in the world. And so maybe that's who I am and what I do is I tell stories of the good in the world. And I'll use whatever medium I can. I'll use whatever platform I can. And when one platform dies, I'll just do it on another. And I hope that my lifelong work will be rooted in telling stories that are hopeful in whatever ways that is. But please don't make me figure out how to use TikTok.
Yeah, TikTok's a whole nother beast. Who knows? So Instagram and social media for you has largely been the kind of the engine behind your success. It's given you this ability to have a voice. It's how I discovered you. It's how we met through social media, and it's helped me get to where I am too today. Yet I'm sure most of the listeners here have seen the social dilemma and this idea that this system that we are now almost completely reliant on is fundamentally broken, that they've turned into engines of manipulation. You mentioned it a couple of times, like you're trying to drown out the noise and you're trying to, break through and fill it with positivity. I don't know. I look at it as maybe this is a losing battle. I'm just wondering, like, how do you feel about this? Because this is how you get stories out into the world.
Yeah, it's a really tricky thing because I have found a lot of success like you with social media. I blew up to 90,000 plus followers on Instagram really early on. I blew up to even more followers on Snapchat really early on. And most recently, Good has blown up to 260,000 followers. And that kind of scaling quickly doesn't happen anywhere else. And so there's so much power and possibility. Like when you're given an audience that big, if you choose to use it for good, which so many people, yourself included, do, then like what a beautiful, powerful thing. But at the same time, like to be on these platforms that are causing so much harm, it's really concerning. And it's a tricky thing. And I'm glad to be wrestling with it. And I think we should all be wrestling with it. But I don't know if we have to like excuse pragmatism. I just think pragmatically is an opportunity to make a difference. And I think the net positive that we can bring on the platform is greater than the negative things that happen here. And so with Good, we largely think about it in terms of if we're the best part of this platform, when we share a post on Instagram, then we've done our jobs and we're doing the right thing. But at the same time, we aren't exclusively on that platform. We have an email audience, we have a newspaper, we've got all these other ways of reaching people. And so one day we totally could just pull the plug and say, we do not support this company anymore. We're just going to drop it. And as a company, we would be okay if our ultimate goal as a company is to help people feel more hopeful and do more good. Quantifiably, we're helping less people, but the people that we're helping on a deeper level. So there's that juggling act again. And so it's something I'm thinking about. But the one thing that did feel good to me is At the end of the social dilemma, the final question they ask everybody is, do you feel hopeful? And surprisingly, I'm pretty sure everybody, or just about everybody, said, surprisingly, yes. Here's why I feel hopeful. And there's a lot of work to be done. But I think that just seeing the documentary makes me feel more hopeful, because I know that millions of other people are also watching this, and we're recognizing the way that this is shaping not just others, but ourselves. And I know I've taken a good hard look at how information makes its way to me and the biases that that brings with it. And it's also helped me feel a little bit more understanding of the people who are being terrible humans, even people in my life who I know who are just posting the most terrible things or believe the most terrible things. It's not that I'm forgiving them. It's not that I'm giving them a pass, but I see how they were manipulated to that point. And there's probably ways that I may have been unknowingly manipulated as well, or at least if I'm not careful, I will be. And so just that awareness actually makes me feel a lot better. And I hope that awareness grows. I hope that there's a lot more systemic changes. And I think we all have the opportunity to be a part of that. And at one point, it might mean a giant boycott of some of these platforms in a way that affects ad revenue. And when that day comes, I think that will be a great action to take. And there will probably be a lot of other actions that we can all take in the coming months and years. I don't know what they are yet, but it is cool to think that we truly do have power in this situation. As the people who are the product, we have the power to shift some things. It's super complex and tricky, but it's definitely something I'm thinking about constantly.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, like, on one hand, you don't want to be complicit. Yep. But on the other, if you just left, and then you would actually be opening up people to even more bias and even more negativity.
Exactly. You don't want to just leave the bad actors in there. Also, if it's only bad actors, I think a lot of other people would leave too. So,
of course.
Yeah, such a good point.
Yeah. And one of the things that you've done really interestingly in terms of the ad revenue, one thing that I've really admired is that you don't take advertising money from just anyone. You specifically take the time to find the most sustainable, responsible companies that you possibly can find in order to support your system. Was that there from the start, or is this something that you've recently implemented?
Yeah, we are super intentional about making sure that anybody that we partner with on the brand side lives up to our values. And it's really tricky because, again, we could make so much more money if we just didn't have values. But we work really hard to maintain our values. When you see a brand like in partnership with Good, it's somebody that we made the choice to work with. And here's the tricky part. I will say there isn't a company in the world that's perfect. You think about a company like a Ben & Jerry's and a Patagonia whose social missions are on their sleeves and they care deeply about the world. There's still problems with the dairy industry, even if they're doing the best that they can. There's still problems with consumerism, even if Patagonia is pushing back against it, or with the travel industry. There's all these layers of problems. And so ultimately, we celebrate progress over perfection. And we're not going to choose a company that's actively creating a net negative in the world, but we want to celebrate when companies do good. And similarly, we're a huge fan of consumers voting with their dollar. I think it's so good when you can say, which of these companies actually aligns more with my values? By making those decisions, you can just financially reward the companies that you care about. And so the same goes for us. When we see companies doing good, let's reward them by allowing them to reach our audience, and let's reward them by choosing them over a competitor because they're choosing to do something good for people or planet.
When we look at impact, there's always this sense that, just find like the people who are having a positive impact, but it's never just positive impact. It always comes with some negative in it. So there has to be a calculation that's being made. There's always going to be some amount of rationalization. And I think the best thing you can do is to be honest about it. And I love what you've done there. I do want to touch on one point. I'm so curious personally on how you went from being an independent creator, which I currently am, to being someone who runs an organization. Tell me what that was like and probably what I should really not do. What lessons did you learn?
The things you shouldn't do is everything I did, but we'll figure it out as we go. For me, it started off with just having some really good friends who were supportive of me. And they were willing to do me a few favors or to do some things to help me out for less than they should have gotten paid. When I decided to start the Good newspaper, it was because of a conversation in the kitchen of my co-working space with a few creatives who I deeply admired, who just contributed a few ideas. I was like, what if I do this thing? And one person was like, yeah, you should design it like this. And another person was like, oh, I've heard that you can ship it like this. And another person said, I would be happy to help write some stories. And all of a sudden, this thing came together as a collaboration and everybody was getting underpaid. I think my goal was to be the most underpaid person in that process, which not everybody has the ability to do, but like I still had Snapchat money rolling in. And so I was willing to do that. And then as time went on, it really was just me working with a few friends who were independent contractors, getting paid less than they deserved, but they were generous and kind to me. And over time, I was basically just doing everything myself. I was bridging the gap. I was privileged enough to really have like this money from social media influencer world bankrolling me through my first, not just 1, but 2 years. So I didn't take a paycheck. I still don't take a paycheck from Good now that I think about it. And so
what? You don't?
Part of it is just like pragmatic, where it's like, I still make money on my own stuff as a photographer and as an influencer. And so I don't need to live a lavish lifestyle. So I'm the only employee in that company. And so I should just take a paycheck from that. I guess it's pragmatic and I haven't really thought about it, but Good now has 5 employees. And the thing that got me from scrappy to having 5 people on the team, and again, we're not that big. It's not like everybody's making a huge amount of money at this point, but it was just one step at a time. It was me figuring out how to do everything myself until I couldn't do it anymore. So the first thing was customer service. I just broke. At 1 month, I was just like, I cannot keep up with the customer service. So I will hire somebody first at 10 hours, then at 20 hours, then up to 40 hours. And then I was like, oh, we need to create more content. So instead of just like the small amount of content being created for the newspaper, we brought on somebody who could spend more time and devote more time writing and creating things for the paper. And over time, just the team got bigger and bigger, but like we're not taking like VC money. We've said no to every investor who's approached us so far. We have intentionally just said, let's grow this thing small, let's bootstrap it, and let's grow slow so that we can do our best to take care of each other and to grow this thing responsibly. I think a lot of harm can come to the mission of a company if you're forced to grow quickly. And we care about our mission above all else. And so we just lean into growing as we can when we can. And besides that, I'm not a huge fan of hustle culture, but the one place where I think it applies is just saying like, where can I work smarter, not harder, to accomplish these tasks? And when I no longer have the capacity to do that, I pass that on to somebody else. And when they no longer have the capacity, we bring on another person and so on and so forth.
Wow. Okay. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yeah, I guess so.
Proverb.
That's it.
No, yeah. Hey, thank you so much for your time. I just want to end on one last thing. And that is, if you had a megaphone to the world, what would you ask people to do?
I think genuinely, I would echo the words of Mr. Rogers and say, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And I think when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel like we're on empty, if we genuinely were to all pause and say, this is heartbreaking. It's okay to feel that, but there's also got to be more to this than that. There are probably helpers. And if we look for those helpers, then I feel like we're inclined to support those helpers and then to become the helpers. And it just perpetuates this beautiful cycle of generosity and goodness. So I would say, look for the helpers.
Cool, man. Thank you so much. That's a beautiful ending. Really appreciate your time on this podcast. It's great having you.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here.
So there you have it, guys. That was Branden Harvey at Good. Make sure to go check them out if you're looking for some more good news at goodgoodgood.co, or follow Branden on Instagram. That's BrandenHarvey. He's obviously a really positive guy and a joy to follow. I don't know about you guys, but this conversation with Branden really gave me a different lens through which to see the world, a different way to process all of the negativity, and to take accountability for finding the positive and giving it a chance to thrive inside of my mind. As always, we have a summary of this episode at impacteverywhere.org for you to enjoy. And remember this wonderful conversation to share it with those that you think would benefit from it. So if this struck a chord with you, make sure to let me know. I'm always interested to hear feedback on how I can do better, what kind of guests you want to see, or just what resonated with you. Next week, we have a luxury architect coming on board, which is, I know, not the first thing that pops into mind when you think of impact. But Bill Bensley is a really special human, and he's brought sustainability into the work that he does in a way that no one else is doing in his industry. Bill and I got a chance to work together a couple years ago after he found my work on the internet, and he's got this sense of wonder and curiosity that he brings into everything he does that truly makes him a joy to have a conversation with. If that sounds interesting to you, make sure to tune in next week, and remember to stay positive, folks, because impact is everywhere.